Greetings and welcome, I'm Ash, and today I would like to give you my review and thoughts on Obsidian's latest RPG, Tyranny. As far as spoilers are concerned, I've made sure to only include footage from the first hour or so of gameplay, so unless I've done something incredibly stupid, you should be perfectly safe. That aside, have you noticed how in most movies and games, the good guys win through either the power of love, a magical McGuffin, or some sort of ancient prophecy they discovered 10 minutes ago? But have you ever wondered what would happen if the clearly superior villain ended up being the victor in that grand, climactic battle between good and evil? Would that be the end of all, or would the bad guys establish a new set of laws to govern the now unified nations of the world? And what about all of the armies of monsters and men that have suddenly found themselves without a cause to rally behind? Well, if you're interested in the answers, you'll be glad to hear that it is exactly these topics that Tyranny explores, but not in a superficial or patronizing way, but with a surprising degree of nuance. The good guys aren't all that pristine and will gladly resort to devious methods in order to achieve their goals, while the majority of the bad guys are simply terrified cogs in the machine. All of this serves to make both sides feel like actual people, rather than overly simple representations of concepts such as good and evil, which goes a long way towards making the world of Tyranny all the more intriguing. But since this is a game we're talking about after all, I'm sure the big question on everyone's mind is whether Tyranny is any fun to actually play. Well, allow me to show you what exactly it's all about, and you can hopefully work it out from there. As with all RPGs that feature plenty of combat and skill-based exploration, I would like to first talk about the character creation system. Besides the usual stuff such as choosing your appearance and setting up your stats, Tyranny also sports a couple of rather unique little details not found in many other D&D inspired games. By this I mean the ability to multi-class from level 1, and the ability to start off by being proficient in not just one, but two fighting styles. For most people, this is completely irrelevant, but since I enjoy playing my RPGs as a war mage, i.e. a fighter with the ability to buff himself and throw debuffs at the opposition, this has been a great boon. Instead of having to spend 20 hours before I'm able to even begin constructing my favorite playstyle, if the game allows me to do so at all, in Tyranny I have the ability to just start out as one. And before you ask, no, paladins do not count. They tend to be far too limited when it comes to role-playing and also a bit too self-righteous for my tastes. The second thing you may want to pay attention to during character creation is your skills, most notably athleticism, lore, and subterfuge. Much like all other classic RPGs, and this includes Obsidian's Pillars of Eternity, these skills are used both in combat and outside of it. What might come as a surprise, however, is just how often these spells end up being useful. When I first started out, I didn't know what to level up, so I just dumped a bunch of points into athleticism, just to make my character just a tiny bit beefier. As it turns out, that was a bloody brilliant idea, as the first hour of gameplay probably had a dozen or so locations I could only reach by climbing, grappling, or otherwise using those glorious muscles I magically grafted onto myself. Nothing excites me more in an RPG than being able to use my skills in order to access new locations or to steer the dialogue in a different way. So to see so many diverse choices in Tyranny is a wonderful thing indeed. And speaking of dialogues, I can't say I expected to see athleticism being on equal ground with the rest. For example, if there is a hostage situation, you can either use your knowledge of diplomacy to defuse the problem, as you would expect, or you can use athleticism to feign surrender before disarming your opponent, or just plain old lie your ass off until they surrender due to subterfuge. There's plenty of other choices as well, but the important thing here is that you can solve nearly every single situation, but more on this later, in a variety of clever and fairly sensible ways. And for an RPG, you really can't ask for much more. But the final part of character creation is perhaps the most intriguing one. Instead of simply choosing your backstory from a number of preset options that all boil down to one sentence, Tyranny allows you to play through an entire choose-your-own-adventure storyline in order to better shape your character. by having to deal with actual problems, most of which have no obvious solution or best answer. You are better able to form what exactly your character is all about, and more importantly, what the world of Tyranny is all about. However, being dumped into this vast and complex world before you've even seen it is quite problematic. Unless you've spent an hour on the wiki before starting up Tyranny, you'll probably have no idea who the Voices of Nerad is, or who in the world are the disfavored. Thankfully, Obsidian was well aware of these issues, and so they have decided to do the only sensible thing: add a wiki into the game. Obviously, it's not as comprehensive as some of the fan sites out there, but the easy-to-access in-game descriptions for important locations and characters are a great way for players like me to learn a tiny little bit more, but also a great way for new players to learn what in the blazing hells is even happening. It certainly helped me a lot during my first few hours in Tyranny because it constantly kept chucking random names, locations, and events in my face without a whole lot in terms of explanation. Mind you, this isn't because the writing in Tyranny is clumsy or misguided, rather far from it. The reason is that the world Obsidian has cooked up for Tyranny is so vast and so expansive that it's next to impossible to get anyone acclimated within a single hour. There are numerous factions you need to keep in mind given how pivotal of a role they play. There's the Grand Overlord Kairos, who you simply must obey or die resisting, as well as a whole bunch of rebels trying to fight against the inevitable. When you combine all of these factions with numerous notable characters that habit each of them, you get a proper mess. But to Tyranny's credit, it is one incredibly fascinating mess. Instead of having the usual hero's journey where you go across the world to find magical artifacts with which you can beat the bad guy, you are instead trying to conquer those that still resist the already triumphant Kairos. And just to prove that Kairos is not kidding around, the very first thing that happens in-game is that you get an ultimatum. Either you ensure that the resistance is crushed within 1 week, or Kairos will demolish a massive chunk of the continent in order to show everyone how the job is done. And no, you do not get to retreat before this happens. With most villains, that will be an empty threat, but Kairos does not joke around, and as such, the spell is already in motion. It is up to you to stop it, or die trying. Given this rather motivating order, I was instantly compelled to do whatever it takes to actually win, and the first thing that went out of the window was my morality. In most RPGs, I play as the paragon of virtue and justice, going around and being helpful towards anyone I can. But in Tyranny, I must admit I became somewhat of a monster. I set entire stretches of farmland on fire, I razed cities to the ground, I butchered rebels by the 100, and I did some things I would rather not talk about. Worst of all, for my sanity anyway, it became easier after a while because you can swiftly justify everything by saying, if I don't do this, they'll all be dead in a week anyway. It is truly impressive how Tyranny slowly eases you into the role of a bad guy, and before you know it, you're exactly the type of henchman other RPG players would fight as some sort of final boss. With clever writing, superb voice acting, and some truly terrific plot points, I must admit I really got immersed into the world of Tyranny. So much so that I managed to complete the entire game within 3 days, and this includes plenty of hours where I've just roamed around the various encampments, talking to anyone about anything, including boring and mundane things such as, "How's the store going?" while sitting in the middle of a war zone. The only thing I can truly complain about in Tyranny's story is how some choices feel a bit forced upon you, even though they feel like they should have multiple solutions available. This is especially obvious with the conflict between the Disfavored and the Crimson Chorus, two factions I tried to keep as equal as possible, but which ended up forcing me to pick a favorite anyway, essentially rendering all previous dialogue pretty much pointless. Thankfully, the companion characters are some of the most interesting people around, and unlike the factions, you get to pick and choose which ones you enjoy playing with. My favorite ended up being Verse, a seemingly bloodthirsty savage with a wit as sharp as her blades. Ironically enough, I started off by hating her, mostly because she was being a douchebag towards everyone we met, but after spending actual hours talking with her, I've slowly come to realize who she really is and why she acts like she does. I won't spoil the revelation for you, but let's just say it was worth the trouble. The same applies to pretty much all of the other characters, as they mostly start grumpy and generally unlikable, but eventually open up and reveal what sort of insane circumstances got them stuck in the same hellhole as you. It is really fascinating stuff, so if you end up playing Tyranny, make sure to occasionally have a chat with your fellow travelers. You might be surprised with what you hear from them. Unfortunately, I have to end all of this story talk on a bit of a down note. While I've generally enjoyed the world of Tyranny, so much so that I'm willing to overlook how linear it is, the ending had left me both furious and disappointed. I'll keep this as vague as possible to avoid any spoilers, but throughout the entire game, the story was hyping up this big confrontation and a massive reveal about Kairos, only to then pull the rug in front of my face and just end in the most unsatisfactory of ways.
What do you need to know?
I really can't say more without giving the plot away, but let's just say that it's quite obvious Tyranny is setting itself up for a sequel. While I'm really glad they are considering it given how compelling Tyranny has been so far, the final hour or two felt way too rushed to offer a satisfying conclusion, which is a massive shame considering what was constantly teased in front of me. As for the combat part of this combat RPG, it is simply okay. If you've ever played Pillars of Eternity, or really any of the other modern D&D inspired games, you probably already know how this works. Where Tyranny does things differently, however, is in the amount of spells and abilities it allows you to have. Even rogues and rangers, classes that usually just sit around and auto-attack in most other RPGs, have so many spells that you can't even keep track of them all. This isn't a complaint from me, mind you, as the overabundance of spells allows you to get rather creative with how you dispatch your enemies, something I personally appreciate a great deal. The second big thing Tyranny does differently is the spell system. Instead of simply giving you a Frostbolt equivalent and calling it a day, Tyranny allows you to modify that Frostbolt with a variety of affixes in order to create a unique variant of that same spell. So that boring old Frostbolt can become an area effect spell, a spell that radiates intense cold from your hands in a small area, and things like that. And best of all, since Tyranny allows you to play as a melee mage hybrid, I was able to mold my war mage into the nearly perfect close quarters combatant. Since all of that sounds pretty good, at least to me anyway, I'm sure you're now wondering why I started this combat chapter saying it's simply okay. Well, the answer to that question lies not in the combat mechanics, but in the enemies you fight. Much like Dark Souls 2, all you seem to fight in Tyranny is a wide variety of dudes in armor. There's dudes wearing heavy armor, dudes wearing light armor, dudes shooting arrows at you, and if you are lucky, dudes in dresses casting spells at you. What amazes me the most is the simple fact that Tyranny has some really cool non-humanoid enemies, but they appear incredibly rarely and only for a couple of encounters before simply vanishing back into the Nether. This alone would be annoying, but Tyranny also has a problem with balance, by which I mean that the normal difficulty is so easy I could practically beat it with my eyes closed. I did try out the harder difficulties, and to Tyranny's credit, they do actually improve the AI rather than add a bunch of more dudes to kill, but it still doesn't help ease the monotony. To be honest, I was grateful the normal difficulty was so easy because there is only so many dudes in armor you can cleave through before you start wishing for generic RPG critters to come back and spice things up. By the time I reached the midpoint, I would have killed for some dire beavers to fight against, or just anything that isn't a dude in armor. The combat beatdown doesn't end there, however, as I have one final complaint. The friendly AI is completely lackluster. So if you don't like pausing your game constantly in order to ensure they don't just stop their attacks for no damn reason, you're probably going to get very annoyed very quickly with Tyranny. But while that is a minor bug I can easily see fixed, the bigger problem in Tyranny is pathfinding. Since you have some spells that require multiple characters to participate, one to knock an opponent down and the other to stab them for example, you will need both of them to walk up to your target. You will think this is an easy thing to do, but oftentimes my characters just kind of walked in place or flat out just stood still. And if you don't personally move them out of this trance, you will have 2 out of your 4 party members just kind of sitting there, trying to cast a spell that will never go off because one of the participants is stuck giving combat hugs to the enemy. While it might seem I'm being a bit unnecessarily harsh on Tyranny here, the reality is that I'm just saddened when I think about how glorious the combat could have been. The mechanics are there, the spells are there, the animations and effects are there, but the battles themselves are so repetitive I ended up just wishing for them to be over so that I can go back to the actually interesting stuff. On the positive side, I could easily see future patches and expansions fixing these problems. So here's to hoping Obsidian manages to do just that because Tyranny really does deserve better. Tyranny is flawed, there is no doubt about that, but it is one of the rare few RPGs that dares explore some of the darker, more mature topics out there. And while the combat may have been disappointing, the lore and the characters have been so enticing to me that I've managed to binge through the entire game within 3 days. So if you're a fan of RPGs, and more importantly of Obsidian's previous work, I have a feeling you're going to enjoy Tyranny as well. Despite my criticism, I can comfortably say I've had a great deal of fun with it and that I would love to play it again after a couple of patches. But even if all of my complaints put you off, I would still recommend keeping a close eye on Tyranny and its future developments. The current version might be a bit of a flawed gem, but for an expansion or 2 and maybe even a sequel, I could easily see it polished up into a shining example for all RPGs. So don't write Tyranny off just yet, it's not that far away from greatness. Thank you guys for watching, and if you enjoyed this, or even if you didn't, please do let me know. And if you would like to see more, you can either subscribe here, or you can check out the website link down below. That one tends to be updated far more frequently. With all of that said, I hope you guys have a nice day, and I will see you soon. See ya!